history that I am least familiar with, and that is the Mennonites who came from the Netherlands and eventually would end up migrating, well, yeah, we'll get to it, but they migrated several places, but they eventually migrated to Manitoba with no shortage of conflict in that. So we're gonna do our very best at working through this. I'm gonna be probably asking for some assistance from some of you guys who know this topic probably more than I do. My resource that I was mainly using this week was this book called Circling the Globe. It is a super interesting book to read, and it basically just talks about the story of specifically our conference, which is the Evangelical Mennonite Conference, that I know off the top of my head, and how it started. So our history and our focus is going to be mainly from that perspective, because that's where we are today. And so if there are questions that go beyond the EMC and specifically the Kleine Gemeinde, it took me so long to say that name right. Oh man, you guys should be so proud of me. Thank you. It was like that was so hard to get that name, and so but we're going to be focusing on that one, and yeah, we'll see where it takes us. If there are any questions that go beyond the Kleine Gemeinde and the EMC, I will do my best to answer it, but I will probably need to relay it off to other people. So we'll pray, and then we'll get started. Thank you, Lord, for this day, and God, we are again just baffled by the wonder of your history and how you are intricately working through us, through our mistakes, through our heritage, and through our ancestors. And so we ask, Lord, that we would humbly come before you this morning, eager to hear your word and to hear how you have been working in us throughout so many centuries, God. Amen. So at the beginning of your handout, I'm just going to read it. This kind of serves as a bit of a overarching statement for what we're gonna talk about and the trends that we'll see. So it says I have one right here. Yeah, thanks. So it says, throughout history, the Mennonites were tolerated and sometimes praised for their usage of reclaiming and prospering the land they were in. The majority of the time, the Mennonites would leave a country when the government began to push down on regulations that went against the Mennonite values and beliefs. Specifically, when it had to do with schools and how the Mennonites were told to respond to military. Would that be a good summary for people who know this history a little bit? Yeah? Okay. I've been talking a lot with Ken and Lorna, and so I'm probably going to be looking at you guys a lot this morning. So, so basically what happened is we're going to kind of work our way through where they were in the 1800s to where they are now. And so I'll work through different chunks. We'll pause, and I'll give you the opportunity to ask questions, and then I will joyfully respond with those questions by saying, Ken, Lorna, what do you think? And I won't do it all for you guys, but I'll definitely be doing it for some of it. So 1800, last week we left off Menno Simons. He was like the usher-in of the Mennonite people, and he was part of the Anabaptist movement. He mainly focused in the Netherlands, And during that time, there was some severe persecution that was going on. We talked about a little bit last week how the Anabaptists experienced about the same amount of persecution as the great persecution that happened before in the first 3 centuries of the church. So it's quite significant. And so in the 1800s, the Mennonites were going to be focusing again on the Kleine Gemeinde and where they come from. So that's, and they don't come until a little bit later, but there's a group of Mennonites that go from the Netherlands to Poland, and then eventually to Russia. And so in 1800s, I thought it was very interesting. There was 15 villages with about 90,000 acres of farming that they moved into. In 1835, there was 1,200 families in 58 villages called the Molashkina, probably, okay. The Molashkina colony. Does anybody want to take a guess? Anybody know what that? Molashkina? Molashkina, okay. There you go, see, this is what I was hoping for in this class. Yeah, the Molashkina colony. And so, I had a typo in my notes. I thought it was interesting that the colonies, in my head before I was reading this, I had an image that the colonies were like one village. And that's what a colony was. So it was one village with like a whole bunch of people that lived in it. And so it was very interesting to find out that actually one colony made several different villages in one kind of area. So I thought that was pretty cool. And so it made sense because there would be these, the civil leaders or the mayors of these villages would often go to the elders of the church to deal with civil affairs. Because they were the people who were like the unofficial, official leaders in the whole colonies. I also found it very interesting just how fast these people spread out and multiplied in like 35 years. It was crazy. And so kind of the thing that we talked about at the beginning in that little blurb, these Mennonites, they would come into these lands and they would, basically, the government loved that they were there because they would take the agriculture and they would basically make their whole economy a lot more wealthy because all these Mennonites were hardworking farmers.
Somebody had started here in Canada, actually, and they were going to sue the government for the land that was taken away from them. And the Russian government said, what do you mean? Like, come back, you can have it, and come work it.
Oh, okay.
They said, yeah, please come back.
Yeah.
It's all yours. You can have it for free.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it is interesting how there would be these like huge masses of Mennonites who would leave because the government would start shifting what they were allowed to do and not allowed to do. And then all of a sudden they would have these like mass droves of people leaving. And then the government would be like, oh no, like our economy is actually gonna take a huge hit because all of these people who are kind of weird and not, they're on these colonies and they don't, we don't really associate with them, but they have made a lot of contributions to our economy. So yeah, it is interesting. So the Chortitza colony was a colony that was started in Russia when they migrated to Russia. And then afterwards, near the Kortitzer colony was the Moloshna colony. And so what we found was I thought it was very interesting that the way that the developments of the Mennonites and the corruption that started happening in the Mennonites, it was not unlike what happened with Constantine, where they basically, the Christians in this area, they were heavily persecuted, but then they became less persecuted, and the lesser that they became persecuted, the more they allowed apathy and corruption to start trickling into their colonies. So it's a very interesting observation. I'm not making an observation about today, okay, but I just think it's something that's worth taking note of, that seems to have happened in history. And so what started happening in the Moloshna colony, the Kortitzer colony, I'm kind of jumping everywhere here. The Kortitzer colony, if I'm understanding it correctly, their theology became quite corrupt in the sense that they started to be quite abusive to their people. And so the Moloshna colony was formed, and that colony grew quite exponentially. But even within the Moloshna colony, there was this guy named Peter Enns, who was the kind of the main elder, and he started becoming apathetic towards the Mennonite belief system. So things like pacifism. He was a proponent for pacifism, but when there would be, when the government would want to come in and start getting more involved on the colony, he, instead of pushing them away, would actually start kind of inviting them in more. And when we look at it today, it's kind of like, in our culture, we don't necessarily think it's that big of a deal, but for the Moloshna colonies and the old Mennonites, this was a huge deal, because there was a very clear divide between church and state. And so any kind of Mennonites who were associating more with the government coming in, it did not go well. And so they actually saw that in that time as being a sign that this person was actually walking away from the faith, that they were losing their salvation, that they were becoming too worldly, which is it's very fascinating. Before we get into the beginnings of the Kleine Gemeinde, does anybody have any questions or any things they want to add? You can just put your hand up and then we can come to you. Oh, okay. Okay. So, Klaus Reimer, he is the man who's known for being the start of the Kleine Gemeinde. And so the Kleine Gemeinde, it just means small church. And so what happened was Klaus Reimer, he migrated from Poland into Russia, into the Moloshna colony. And he recognized that there is abuse happening, and there's stagnancy happening. There's some stuff happening in the colony that he was not in agreement of. And it became increasingly more and more aware that there needed to be some type of divide that was happening. To the point where, and this kind of climaxed at communion, where Peter Enns wanted to partake in communion after forcibly removing somebody from the church after a questionable thing that they were doing. And when I say questionable, I can't remember what it was, but the way, and I don't know if the author actually talks about it, but the way they described it was, it wasn't something that necessarily needed that kind of response, but for Mr. Enns, he forcibly grabbed this person and threw them out, and it resulted in actually a lot of physical pain and injury that this guy caused. And then afterwards, he went and wanted to partake in communion. And so again, we look at some of this stuff today, and we think like, okay, like, that's a little bit weird, but I don't know if you shouldn't take communion. Is a different conversation. But for the Mennonites, this was like a huge thing. Like, you have unresolved sin, and you have questionable leadership tactics, and now you want to partake in the Lord's Supper? Like, that can't happen. And so for Klaus Reimer, he began separating himself from the Molochna colony and started bringing kind of followers with him to do that. And so that happened, that was in 1812.
This information is from a storybook that I just recently read about this Klaus Reimer, exactly like how he was different from the normal Mennonite community in, I think, Prussia. Is that also Poland? Like nowadays Poland? Yeah, how he saw how the wealthy people really separated themselves from the poor. They disliked anybody that was poor, and the people that have read the book by Johann Platt, I think it is, he was a son of a family that was very, very rich, and he was totally disinherited because he asked questions and he married a young girl that was very poor. So there was, and he respected the Klaus Reimer. So and because there are a lot of names, the same family after family, like there was the original Klaus Reimer, and then later his son was the elder in Molochna. And when he heard this, Johann Platt heard about him, then he migrated to Russia as well and joined the church at the end of his life after having gone through horrible things in the Mennonite faith or whatever.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, Lorna. I'm glossing over a lot of things here because just time-wise, but there is a lot of things that we're not going to be talking about that I think it's worth looking into. So basically what happened after Reimer started the Kleine Gemeinde, they kind of took their group, and there was, at this point, there was a bit of a distinction. There was the Kleine Gemeinde and then the Gross Gemeinde, which was just a big church. That's what it means. And so the Kleine Gemeinde, they took a group of their people and they went 100 kilometers, I can't remember the amount, 108 kilometers north and purchased 18,000 acres, and they started a colony there. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to fast forward because we won't have enough time. So basically, what happens as the colony grows and develops, there is more of an influence in the Russian government that starts coming in. Where at one point in time they were like, it's okay if you don't want to be involved in the military. That's totally fine. It's okay if you want to do your own church thing or your own school thing. That's totally fine. We're totally good with that. We're just happy that you're here. And so that lasted like a significant amount of time. But eventually things changed where they're saying like, okay, if you want to be here, you have to be involved in the military. You have to perform different civic duties, like jury duty and administering fines. And Russian had to be enforced in your schools. So in your schools, you had to learn Russian. I'm going to keep coming back to this because it's important. Today, some of these things may make more sense to us. So like requiring a certain language to be learned in a school. Because you're in that community, you're in that culture, so it's helpful to know the language so that you can kind of survive. For the Mennonites, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, this was not the case. And so this was kind of a tipping point for them. They said, that's it, that's enough. We need to find another place to live. And so they developed these things, well, I mean, they had them before, but there were these people called the scouting parties who would just go out and they would travel to different parts of the world trying to find places to live for their people. And so in 1873, there's a scouting party that went out and they found representatives in Manitoba because they had heard that people in North America were living differently with more freedom and more rights. I was watching a documentary and the one person had said, "You can come to America. Like, we're not going to experience wars here for a long time. Like, it'll be fine," which I thought was very funny because they did experience wars. And so they went to America, and so there's actually a large concentration in Kansas as well as Nebraska. Okay, they went to Nebraska first and moved to Kansas. Yeah, and then there was your mom was born in Kansas. Oh, okay. And so there was a movement that went from Nebraska to Kansas, but there was also a movement that went to Manitoba. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. And so I actually really enjoy traveling. I think like going on a plane is just like the coolest invention that we've created as a society. 1873. Does anybody remember when the plane was invented? So, yeah, something like that. Yeah. After this is what I'm getting at. So it took 6 to 8 weeks after the settlers went to Manitoba, recognized this was a good area to settle. They came back, and then they're like, "We're going to go to Manitoba because that'll be a great place for us." And so they all went to Manitoba, and that took about 6 to 8 weeks to get there. Which, like, I like traveling. I would not like that. I don't know about you guys. But. And so, yeah, okay, I'm just trying to, does anybody have any questions right now? Or things they want to fill in? Oh, you guys are so quiet today. So they showed up in Manitoba, and there was a couple things that the government said in Manitoba. You do not have to be involved in the military, and you can do your own thing with the school system. To the best of my knowledge, the military thing is still the same. If I'm wrong, maybe somebody can correct me, but I'm pretty sure it is still the same. But the school thing changed quite a bit. So when they got here, they started basically spreading out in this area. And they recognized, just like all of us come January, that they have the same question that looms in the back of their head as they have to get up in the morning and they have to get into their vehicle and start it and then drive to work. And that question is, why in the world do I live here? And that is exactly what they were saying. Because at the first winter, they were like, oh my goodness, this is not where we were from. This is quite a bit colder. Actually, I was reading stories about it. I was actually reminded of many conversations that Victoria and I have about the cold, cold weather. And it's like, why don't we live in like anywhere else? And so, and so these questions these people were having. And so they hated the winter. And then when the summer came along, they realized that there's these like little bugs that suck your blood, and there's like 1 trillion of them. And you just can't kill them because they keep coming back. And the more I was reading about the history of the Mennonites, the more I was thinking, wow, I can really relate with these people. But they adapted. The Mennonites adapted. They had a different housing system. It was kind of like made of, I think, and you'll have to remind me on this. I think there were times that they made it out of like dirt to try to like keep in insulation in the heat in the winter. If you want to check something out, the Mennonites Museum in Steinbach is actually super interesting because they have all this stuff, and you can learn about this stuff. If you find it really interesting, I think it's pretty cool, and I've been like entrenched in it the past 2 weeks, so I really kind of want to go there. But when they moved here, they founded different towns. The first one was, does anybody know? First town they founded? Kleefeld. Oh, okay. That's not what this book says. Well, the Kleine Gemeinde thing, they said that the first town was Grunfeld. Yeah, so which is Grunthal, which is where I was from. So there you go. Kind of feather in my cap. There you go. They also founded Blumenort and Steinbach and Kleefeld as well. Places that are still going on today and still very much flourishing. And they were allowed to do basically what they wanted initially with the school system. And so they would build houses, they would build churches, and they would build schools. And often the churches and schools were connected. And the government at a certain point actually said, if you want to have a school, we'll actually pay you $100 a year to further your kids' education, which was a huge, huge amount of money back then, especially for people who just came, who had migrated here and really had nothing. And so it was a very great idea. The Kleine Gemeinde did accept that offer, but there were other more conservative Mennonite groups that did not, because they felt that that was already the beginning of merging with church and state. And this was all fine and dandy, because at that point, you could either be a part of a Protestant or a Catholic school division. And so all the Mennonites were big fans of the Protestants. So they all jumped on with the Protestant school division, if that is what they decided, which was the Kleine Gemeinde did. But in 1870, but in 1890, which is 20 years later, the Manitoba Public School Act was formed, and it was a Department of Education that replaced the church board and the school board. So it was a government-run education department that ran all the schools. And at that point, the Kleine Gemeinde was like, okay, like I don't know how we're feeling about that, but like it sounded like they kind of kept going. But then English became a required language that people had to learn in the school systems. And so for the Kleine Gemeinde and the other Mennonites who had migrated from Poland and Russia, all of a sudden they're getting this like little memory in the back of their head. And they're like, man, we just came from this. And so in 1890, English was not a mandated language if there was enough people in the school that didn't want it. But by 1916, it became mandatory. And so that wasn't enough. Yeah, I will say that the Kleine Gemeinde did not leave. They remained with that. And some of the other more conservative Mennonite groups that we haven't talked about, they did decide to like split off from that and do their own things. And the next thing that we're going to talk about is kind of like the culmination that caused the most amount of Mennonites to leave the school system and start their own private schools, and also many of them actually left Canada. And that's when, do you know what it was? Do you know what the big thing was that caused people to leave? Mainly and to go to Mexico? Yeah. Okay. Right, so after the war, there was a lot of conscientious objectors who were actually the ones who built some of our national parks during the war because they didn't go to war. And so some of the parks that we have today, many of them are actually from COs, so it's quite something to think about.
Just a quick note on that. I read accounts from my great-great-grandma, I believe, and some of her boys had to be COs, and you would go and I think they would maybe pay you a bit, but you also had to pay whatever, some sort of fine. So pretty much you were working for free or even paying to be a CO, and that was an honor for them to go and do that.
Okay, your dad was a CO. Okay, that's amazing. So that was a big turn that caused a lot of the Mennonites to actually go down south. Because after that war, after they were COs, they recognized, okay, this could happen again. And maybe the government isn't going to be as lenient. Which I think was actually kind of a fair thing to think about. Another thing that really caused a lot of Mennonites to leave was the school system required the Union Jack flag to be flown on the schools. And yeah, Mennonites did not like that. And so this record indicated that it said that 6,000 Mennonites packed up and went to Mexico when they enforced that. And yeah. Okay.
Would that include maybe the old colony? Like, there are different Mennonite groups here in Manitoba, and I know that the old colony Mennonites, they traveled to Mexico about 20 to 25 years sooner than the Kleine Gemeinde did, and I think the Kleine Gemeinde went to Mexico because of the others that had been there for some years already.
Yeah, so when the Union Jack flag was enforced, many of the Kleine Gemeinde didn't actually go, but it was this progressive thing, I'm guessing after World War II, that really started bringing people more. But yeah, just like what you were saying, Lorna, there were other colonies and other more conservative Mennonite circles that left before. And one question I had, and I actually didn't know this, and does anybody know what caused the Mennonites to come back to Manitoba? Yeah. Yeah.
I heard my dad many times talk about the beautiful wheat fields that he had left. There was farming communities that did well, and a good part of his family did not move to Mexico, so they would come back once in a while and see how prosperous it was. And it was very, very hard to make a living in Mexico the first few years. It has totally changed around. but that was how it was when I was born.
When I was working at the drop-in center in Grunthal, the primary demographic of kids that we were working with were kids that had come from Mexico and Bolivia and Paraguay, from the old colony. And so, yeah, it's, hey? Yeah, so I think there was that reality that when they went to Mexico, they were like, it's actually really hard to be here, and we need to come back. And so even within the past, I'm sure like 100 years, there's been that kind of migration back and forth from Mexico to Canada, as they're recognizing. And at times they go back to Mexico. Like I know during the pandemic, there was that time where you couldn't, like Victoria and I bought a house from a couple who fled to Mexico, I think, because they had, there was the rule that you could only get in the country if you were vaccinated. Is that do you remember what it was? Yeah, or you couldn't travel or something like that. And so before they enforced that rule, there was a bunch of people that sold their home, and it's just so it was quite remarkable.
Well, there were a lot of Mennonites that also expanded into different parts of Mexico. They didn't all come back. It's just amazing how many are still out there.
It was because it's a very dry country and very sandy soil and very windy and dust, and I don't know, what else would you say? Hard to make a living.
It was very hard to make a living there. And I don't know, there are probably others that would answer that question just as well as I do, but for my family, some moved away because there were shootings. The Mexicans were being rude to the Mennonites. I know my sister and her husband, they moved because her husband's uncle got shot, cold-blooded, and they fled. And there were other horrible break-ins where they would break into the community stores, and those that owned them were being mistreated.
Oh man. Okay. Right. But it was a lot of agricultural, right? And just safety wise, right? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, right. Okay. Shoot. Okay, I'm just gonna be very quick here. The Clangemeinde, it developed quite substantially in the Manitoba area, and it just didn't seem to stop the amount of divisions that happened. And I just thought it was just so amazing how there would be these different break-offs from the Mennonites that just kept happening, over and over and over again. And reading this book, it was very eye-opening for me that as Christians, we have this tendency to divide. And we just see it constantly. One of the reasons why the Clangemeinde changed its name to the Evangelical Mennonite Conference is because they wanted to become more outreach focused. Which, again, for us today, it's oh, well, of course, that makes sense. But it didn't always make sense. there was this image of certain Mennonite colonies, not saying all of them, but that there was very like inclusive, that we wanted to kind of keep to ourselves. And so this idea of reaching out to the ends of the earth was very like, people had a hard time with it. It was very hush-hush. And I think we've come a long way from that. And so even in Mexico, the Kleine Gemeinde church is still called the Kleine Gemeinde. Yeah, it's this huge thing, okay. Yeah. And so it's, yeah. It is, I just think it's a very interesting thing when we look at our history, because now we're not talking about, whatever, 300 or 400 years ago, like we were talking about last week. Now we're talking about, this happened under 100 years ago. And I think it's important for us to recognize that some parts of our history that we don't necessarily agree with, that they're not as far off from us as we think they are. Because we're on, I don't know if you want to hear this or not, but we're on our 19th class in church history right now. And for the past, like, however many we've been doing, we can really separate ourselves a lot from this. Where it's like, wow, back then, way back then, they were doing some crazy stuff. Like Inquisition, whew, boy, that's crazy. But it's like, I was reading this article where in 1911, the first guy was excommunicated from the church for buying a car. 1920, it was acceptable to drive cars. It's like, that's a very short amount of time, and that is not that long ago. So I think, as I'm talking overtime, and I apologize, Bonnie, for your classes downstairs, I think that as we are looking at history and as we are getting closer to our doorsteps of what we believe and how we're influenced by it, I think it's important for us to recognize that we are not as far off from the bad decisions that we made. And they have shaped us, and they have defined who we are. And there's a level of responsibility that we need to have for that. At the same time, I think that there can be a lot of good that's happening in some of these Mennonite colonies. Especially these colonies that are seeking to reach out to the ends of the earth. And maybe we want to see ourselves as a colony that's seeking out to the ends of the earth. Maybe you don't want to call yourself a colony, that's okay. But we are a body of believers who, and I'm really excited about how the EMC has progressed. We are a body of believers who are focused on reaching out to the ends of the earth. So, go in peace, everyone.